Hi there. So today I'm going to demonstrate how to remove the clutch assembly from a B7 supercharger in order to service the clutch bearings. Now, this procedure is applicable to all supercharged Alpina models. That includes the B5, B6, and the B7. If you experience any pulley wobble or screeching or whining sound coming from the pulley, that means that the bearings have reached the end of their life, they're going bad, and they need to be replaced. Now, according to Alpina and ASA, the manufacturer of these supercharger units, the service life for the clutch bearings is 3,000 engine operating hours. This is approximately 60,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers, at which point they recommend replacement of the bearings as part of the supercharger service and preventative maintenance. Now, in the past, you could purchase a service kit directly from BMW, and it retailed for about $700 to $800. This kit included an all-new clutch hub, clutch bearings, clutch friction plates, and the clutch assembly removal tool. As expensive as this kit was, unfortunately it is no longer available from BMW. So they simply don't sell it anymore, or Alpina doesn't make it, which means that for us Alpina owners, we can no longer get replacement parts to maintain our superchargers and to keep our cars up and running. So as a result of this, and to keep my own 2007 and 2008 B7s up and running, I developed my own clutch bearing service kit, which you can see here, which consists of two bearings. Now, these are identical OEM Alpina spec bearings. They are a combination of a single row deep groove ball and needle roller bearings with the dual NBR contact seals on both sides. So these are the same bearings that Alpina used and the same ones that came on the cars from the factory. Basically, my approach to this is that I wouldn't want to use any other bearings in the supercharger except for the ones that were originally spec'd for it by Alpina. In addition to the bearings, I offer my own clutch assembly removal tool, which makes it very easy for anyone at home or in their garage to service their supercharger and replace the clutch bearings, especially if you're experiencing the aforementioned pulley wobble or screeching or whining sound coming from the pulley. So with that in mind, let's get started and replace these bearings. Okay, so to get to the clutch bearings, we first need to remove this pulley, and to do so we need to undo these 4 bolts. Now, these are E10 external Torx head bolts. I took the liberty of loosening them beforehand off camera to help speed up the process. So now I'm just going to go ahead and remove them quickly by hand, like so, and set them aside here on the table. So now we're ready to remove the clutch. The pulley. Okay. So now that we removed the pulley, you'll notice this is what it looks like on the inside. Now, full disclosure, I've actually serviced this supercharger beforehand off camera. I've replaced the internal oil seals. I've replaced the high precision impeller shaft bearings. And I'm going to just show you how to do the clutch bearings. And while I was there, I took the time to thoroughly clean the inside of this pulley. That's why it's nice and shiny. When you do remove your pulley, you'll notice that there'll be quite a bit of caked dust and debris. This is dust that will come from the friction pads, the clutch friction pads. There would be also some grease deposited potentially. This will be from the bearings themselves. And the inside will look very similar to brake calipers and the brake dust that you see on brake calipers. So it's very important when you put it back together to clean it thoroughly so that all this dust and debris doesn't recirculate back into your new bearings. So that's why this is so clean. So I'm going to put this here aside. Then we remove this plate, like so. And now we're left with this hexagonal spacer. Even though it looks like a nut, it's actually a spacer. You'll see why in just a second. And the center bolt. So to remove the center bolt in the hexagonal spacer, I'm going to use a 6mm bit and a 27mm wrench. In this particular case, I'm using an adjustable wrench, which works just as well. And again, I did loosen this bolt beforehand off camera, so I'm just gonna undo it by hand to demonstrate. So now that we remove this bolt, we can simply remove this hexagonal spacer. Again, this is why it is a spacer. There's actually no threads on it. It just goes into the bore. So now we're left with the clutch assembly. So these are the two bearings. One is shown here. These are the inertia blocks that serve to create additional mass so that during the rotation, the centrifugal force pushes onto the outside of the flywheel, and that's how the clutch engages the flywheel and in turn spins the impeller. So now what we're going to do is remove the clutch assembly so that we can remove the bearings. So to do that, we use the clutch assembly bearing removal tool, the kit that I offer, and we insert the threaded pin into the center of the flywheel. We simply screw that in and just tighten it lightly with a 13mm wrench. It really doesn't need to be very tight, just snug is good enough. Next up, we take the threaded plate and we install that onto the shaft, and we screw that in like so. About halfway is good enough. Next up, we take the two bolts that come in the kit and we thread them into two of the tapped holes on the hub that are diagonal, and we simply screw them in by hand. Doesn't need to be tight, like so. Next up, we are ready to rotate the tool counterclockwise in order to screw out and pull the clutch assembly itself. So you'll notice as you start unscrewing the tool, it pulls with it the clutch assembly, and this is actually a good demonstration of how quick and easy it is to remove the clutch assembly with this tool. It makes it very convenient. Anybody can do it at home, and you also actually don't need to remove the supercharger from your car. You can simply do this while the supercharger is still on your car. It just makes it a little bit less ergonomic, but completely doable. So now we've actually removed the clutch assembly entirely. We still have a couple of threads left of engagement on this pin, and here it is. So this is the clutch assembly removed. Now all we have to do is undo these two bolts, like so, remove the tool, and here we're left with the clutch assembly, and now we're ready to press out these bearings and replace them. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so to press out the bearings, you need to use an arbor press or a hydraulic press, or for the purpose of today's demonstration, I am going to be using a ball joint press as shown here. Now you can purchase one from any hardware store, auto parts store, or you can simply rent one from an auto parts store. You simply walk in, you put a deposit, you get the tool, you use it at home, and upon return of the tool, you get your money back at essentially net cost of zero to you, which I think is a great deal and a great solution for someone doing this in their home or in their garage. Now today I'm set up on a bench vise because I happen to have one, and it helps with a video and illustration, but you can do this on your workbench, on the ground, on your desk. It really makes no difference. So let's start by installing the mounting plate onto the ball joint along with the receiving adapter. And now we're going to take the clutch assembly with the bearing facing downward, like so. And now we need something to push the bearing inward. I typically like to use what I have available to me. In this case, I'm using a 1-inch socket or a 25mm socket. Works just as well. It fits actually perfectly inside the clutch assembly hub, and it has just the right amount of contact on the outer races of the bearings to press it. So now I'm just going to tighten the plunger by hand just to get it started. Now I'm going to use a wrench up on top to start driving the the plunger and pressing out the bearing. Now it takes just a little bit of resistance at first and progressively becomes easier. So I'm doing this with one hand, so it's fairly simple. And that's it. That's all it takes. So now both of the bearings have been pressed out. If we retract the plunger, we can remove the socket and we can collect the bearings. Careful not to drop anything. So this is how the bearings came out. Two things you'll notice is that there are actually two bearings. There is a thin bearing and a thick bearing. And in between the bearings is a very thin shim, which is important. So please don't lose that and be sure not to forget it when you reassemble. This shim serves to create a gap condition between the two bearings. So now that the bearings are removed, we can use this time to inspect the inner bore of the hub. Now is a good time to clean it, degrease it, get rid of any contaminants or any dust so that installation of new bearings is made that much easier. So let's go ahead and do that. We place the receiving adapter back onto the mounting plate. We take the hub assembly, put it there. And now we take the two brand new Alpina spec bearings that come with the kit. And now we install the thin bearing first, as such. We simply align it so it's as flat as you can make it. And then we take the socket and we place it onto the bearing. And again, we're just going to be pressing in the bearing in. I can start by hand and I can continue by screwing in the plunger. So you want to screw it in just until the bearing bottoms out, which indicates that the bearing has been seated perfectly. So one bearing is in. Now we can get ready to install the second bearing, the thicker one. To do so, we need to place that shim and then install the thicker bearing. Again, we just want to align it so it's as flat as you can make it. Replace the socket again. And screw in the plunger. I like to start it by hand so I get a good feel of whether it's aligned or not. And there we go, it is. And then I continue with a socket, with a wrench up on top to firmly seat this bearing. And that's it. The bearing has bottomed out. I'm going to back out the plunger. I'm going to remove the socket. And here it is. We have two freshly pressed bearings into the hub. And now we're ready to install it back onto the supercharger. So let's do that. Okay, so now that we've pressed in the new bearings, we can go ahead and reinstall the clutch assembly back onto the supercharger. But before we do that, now is a good opportunity to inspect the bearings, make sure that they are seated properly, make sure that they rotate freely. And it's also a good opportunity to inspect the clutch friction pads, make sure they're not chipped anywhere, there's no cracks, there's no damage, and there's no damage to the friction material here. Alpina recommends a minimum thickness of 2 millimeters. I have measured this particular unit off camera and it is good to go. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall it back into the supercharger. I'm going to place the clutch assembly back onto the flywheel. And now I'm going to take the spacer that came with the clutch removal tool and put it onto the bearing. I'm going to take the plate, screw that back on until it engages the spacer. And now I'm simply going to start by rotating clockwise and screwing in the clutch assembly. And as I do that, it pushes in the clutch assembly back into the bore of the flywheel. This again demonstrates how easy it is to reinstall the clutch assembly with the use of this tool. It is very convenient. I'm using very little force. I'm doing it with one hand, and I don't need any special tools or any power tools to do so. So again, a very nice and convenient tool to have. So now I've reached the end. I can't go any further. That means that the clutch assembly is fully seated, at which point I can remove the tool. Simply unscrewing it, removing the spacer. And I want to make sure that the clutch pads are indeed recessed and underflush with the outer lip or outer edge of the flywheel, and indeed they are. So now that I've checked that, I can go ahead and remove the tool entirely by using a 13mm wrench. I'm just going to loosen the tool and simply unscrew it out, like so. So now I'm ready to put everything back together in reverse order. I'm going to start with the hexagonal spacer. I'm going to simply put that back in. And I'm going to return this bolt. Alpina recommends thread locker on this fastener. They recommend Loctite 243, which is what I have here. Just going to dabble a little bit on the threads, like so, and screw this back in by hand. Now I'm going to continue screwing it in with a 6mm hex bit, like that. I'm going to hold the hexagonal spacer with a 27mm wrench, or an adjustable wrench in my case, and I'm going to torque this bolt to 25 Newton meters as recommended by Alpina. I have a torque wrench that's already set up for 25 Newton meters. I'm just going to go ahead and torque it like so. So now I'm done with that part. So now I'm going to go ahead, put back this plate, making sure that the holes are aligned, like so. And now we can put back the pulley. So to do that, we want to make sure the holes are aligned, and we return and reinstall the hardware. Again, these are E10 external Torx head bolts, and we're going to install all four. And I'm going to tighten them first by hand in a crisscross pattern, just to make sure that the pulley is lined up nicely and it is level and is well seated on the supercharger. Okay, so this is now hand tight. Now I'm going to torque these bolts to 10 Newton meters. I have a torque wrench already set up for 10 Newton meters. And again, in a crisscross pattern, I'm going to torque and tighten these like that. Click, click, and last one, click. So now these are all torqued to 10 Newton meters, and we're essentially done with the clutch bearing replacement. This is ready to go back into the vehicle, and that's pretty much it. That's the procedure. If you need to purchase the clutch bearings or the clutch bearing removal tool, please let me know. Feel free to contact me. I will leave my contact information in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.